Let me read to you a passage from the 8th chapter of St. Mark's Gospel, verses 22 to 26. It's the Gospel for Wednesday of the 6th week in Ordinary Time, Year 1. St. Mark writes, "They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spat on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, 'Do you see anything?' He looked up and said, 'I see people. They look like trees walking around.' Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, 'Don't go into the village.'" That's from Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 26. And what does it suggest to us? Well, if Christ did something once, he can do it again. Indeed, he can do it again and again. Let us place ourselves in the gospel scene that I've read, and in our hearts watch what our Lord does. Some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. That is all they wanted. They wanted Jesus to touch him because they had seen and heard of how our Lord had time and again touched people who were sick, and that touch would leave them healed. That is all they wanted, a touch from Jesus, and their blind acquaintance would be right. But Jesus did not simply touch him. He took him by the hand and led him outside the village. Now, imagine that scene in greater detail. Our Lord is approached by the group of friends with their blind acquaintance. They introduce themselves and direct our Lord's attention to their blind companion and ask that he touch them, that he place his hand on him. Our Lord gazes for a moment on them and on the blind man. He feels pity and compassion for him. Then, perhaps asking them to leave the blind man with him and themselves to go, he takes the blind man with him on a walk outside the village. Imagine our Lord holding the blind man by his hand and leading him along with him. Perhaps he gently converses with him about his family or life, and thus establishes a personal relationship with him. Perhaps a few of our Lord's disciples are in tow. This passage is from Mark, so possibly Simon Peter witnessed the event. And so they arrive outside the village. Then our Lord takes some trouble over this case. He repeatedly places his own spittle on the man's eyes, while asking the blind man if his sight is coming. It gradually comes, and he finally sees with absolute clarity. He sends the blind man off, not back into the village, but home by another route. Presumably, his original companions, as I mentioned earlier, had themselves been directed by our Lord to go home and not to wait. Our Lord had taken the blind man into his own care, led him by the hand himself, and with personal attention cured him. Why did our Lord go through all this when he could have, at a word, sent the man and his companions off with their prayer answered? Well, we do not know because we're not told. Or again, why did our Lord, when on another occasion, pressed by the crowd all around him, and on his way to deal with a case of desperate need, suddenly stop and ask who touched him? The surging crowd had to stop, and our Lord spent minutes looking for the one who had touched him. Power had gone out of him, he said. Well, why had he bothered? Presumably, he wanted to make personal contact with the one who had benefited by power going forth from him. That is to say, each person was important. Each individual is the object of Christ's love. In our case, in the Gospel passage of today that I read, our Lord spends time with the blind man. Of course, it is obvious that our Lord does not want his miracles to dominate the attention of the people. He does not want to be regarded simply as a miracle worker, merely as a source of physical betterment and healing. He wants this aspect of his ministry, at least at this point, to be kept more in the background. There are higher and greater things he was sent to bring to mankind, and he wishes the people to think on a higher plane. So he takes the blind man completely aside. That granted, nevertheless, we are surely able to notice the greater care with an individual that is being exercised here. That blind man would never have forgotten his hand being held by Christ as they walked along. He depended on Christ leading him by the hand to wherever they were going. He would never have forgotten his conversation with Christ as they left the village. He would never have forgotten the finger of Christ, the hand of Christ, pressing gently on his eyes, marking them with his own saliva. He would not have forgotten his sight returning, hearing our Lord's questions, and gazing on Christ for the first time. To see Jesus of Nazareth, the author of his healing. Christ had known him personally and had cared for him in all his individuality. In his need, he had come to know Christ in a very personal manner. What might have come of this we do not know, perhaps little. But it was a personal gift, nevertheless, a special grace. Now, as I remarked at the beginning, if Christ did something once, he can do it again and again. In fact, he does do it again and again. The living personal Jesus takes those who come to him or those who are presented to him in prayer and leads them on with him. If we place ourselves and those we know who are in need in his hands, in all our need, whether we place before him a particular need or our very selves in all our need, he will lead us by the hand, as it were. He takes us with him and gives us the gift of his grace. He shows us his personal concern and attention, and we begin life anew. Let us see ourselves exemplified in the blind man of today's gospel. And let us never drift out of the friendship of Jesus.